6. She said I was trouble. I said I'm your kind of trouble. The weekend had started like any other casual gathering at my friend's place, the kind where laughter spills into the kitchen and the scent of coffee mingles with faint traces of dessert. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few familiar faces, the hum of conversation, and some quiet corners where I could observe without being noticed. That's when I saw her. My friend's aunt, and I'll admit it immediately, she stopped me in my tracks. She had that quiet authority in the way she moved, a kind of grace that seemed effortless but undeniably commanding. I noticed the soft curve of her smile, the slight arch of her brow as she observed me from across the room. She carried herself with confidence, yet there was something in her eyes, a flicker of curiosity, maybe amusement, that hinted at a softer, more vulnerable side. When our eyes met, I felt it instantly, the subtle, electric charge that makes you aware of another person in a way that feels almost magnetic. She walked toward me, and the casual air of the gathering seemed to fade slightly around us. "Your trouble," she said lightly, tilting her head with a playful smirk. Her tone was teasing, but there was an undertone, a warmth, a recognition that she wasn't just saying it to anyone. I matched her gaze, and for a heartbeat, the world slowed. "Your kind of trouble," I replied, letting my voice hover just on the edge of a smile. It wasn't just words. The way we spoke to each other carried a weight, a rhythm, a tension that wasn't there before. I noticed the small things, the way her hand brushed mine briefly as she handed me a drink, the warmth of her laughter as it rolled softly across the room, the subtle tilt of her head as if she were studying me, seeing more than I thought possible. I found myself acutely aware of my own heartbeat, of the way my chest seemed to tighten with anticipation. The air between us was charged, not in a loud, obvious way, but in the quiet, almost imperceptible exchanges, a glance that lingered too long, a subtle lean closer in conversation, a shared laugh that felt like it belonged only to us. Even as I tried to blend back into the gathering, she remained in my mind, like a note that refused to fade. There was a pull I couldn't name yet, an instinct that something about this encounter wasn't casual, wasn't fleeting. And when I caught her looking at me again, that flicker of mischief in her eyes, I realized that maybe she felt it too. This first meeting wasn't about confession, or even overt flirtation, it was about recognition. A subtle spark that hinted at something deeper, something that wouldn't be rushed. The weekend stretched ahead of us, full of moments waiting to be claimed, but in that single exchange, a slow-burning tension had been set into motion. From that first look, that teasing word, and that shared smirk, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't going to be ordinary. And somewhere deep down, I had a feeling that I wouldn't want it to be. The next day unfolded with that unspoken awareness still hanging in the air between us. It wasn't something loud or dramatic, it was quieter, like a thread stretched taut, invisible to everyone else, but impossible for me to ignore. I found myself drifting into the kitchen more often than usual, and somehow, she always seemed to be there. Sometimes it was just coincidence, she reaching for the kettle as I reached for a glass. Other times I wondered if she felt the same magnetic pull that made me linger, slowing my steps just enough to cross her path. Our conversations were light at first, carried by playful banter. She teased me about my age, about how I probably hadn't lived long enough to understand certain things. I countered with quick wit, saying age had nothing to do with understanding, only with noticing. That made her pause, tilt her head, and smile in a way that suggested she hadn't expected that answer from me. It was in those pauses that the tension lived. The spaces between words where glances lasted a fraction too long. Where I'd notice how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the movement graceful and unconscious, yet somehow deliberate when I was watching. Or how her laughter carried a softness that made the world feel lighter, and how, when it faded, the silence seemed charged instead of empty. At one point, she brushed past me to reach for something on the counter. The faint warmth of her shoulder grazed mine, and though the contact lasted barely a second, it left me completely still, as if my body was memorizing the sensation. I glanced at her, and she looked back with a smile that was playful on the surface. But her eyes told another story, one of curiosity and quiet acknowledgement. Later, by the fireplace, we ended up in the same circle of conversation. Friends talked around us, laughter echoing, but I found myself focused entirely on her. She leaned slightly toward me when speaking, her hand resting loosely on the arm of her chair, close enough that if I reached out, I could have touched it. I didn't. Not yet. But the awareness of that possibility filled the space between us, subtle yet undeniable. When I cracked a small joke, she laughed softly, her hand brushing against my arm in that absent-minded, familiar way people do when they feel comfortable. But for me, that touch wasn't absent-minded at all. It was deliberate, meaningful, and it set something inside me alight. The evening passed without anything dramatic, yet everything about it felt significant. Every shared smile, every glance, every brief touch was like adding kindling to a fire neither of us was ready to light fully, but both of us knew was building. By the time I lay in bed that night, the memory of her laughter, the warmth of her hand against my arm, and the way she looked at me when she thought no one else was watching replayed again and again. The flirtation wasn't spoken outright, not in words anyone else would notice, but in the quiet language of closeness and hesitation. It wasn't just play anymore, it was discovery. And though either of us admitted it yet, the unspoken truth was already there. This was a game we were both willing to play. By the third evening, the rhythm of the house had settled. Most people had slipped into easy routines of conversation, music, and quiet laughter. Yet I noticed she had grown quieter. She still smiled, still moved with her usual grace, but there was a shadow in her expression that I hadn't seen before, something thoughtful, perhaps heavy. I found her later, sitting alone at the dining table after everyone else had drifted into other rooms. A half-empty glass of wine sat in front of her, and her gaze was distant, fixed not on the glass but somewhere far beyond it. "Mind if I join you?" I asked softly, not wanting to intrude. She looked up, surprised, and then gave a small smile. "Of course. Sit." I lowered myself into the chair across from her, and for a moment, silence filled the space between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, more like she was deciding whether to let me into the quiet corner of her thoughts. Finally, she spoke. "It's funny," she said with a small, wistful laugh. "Everyone thinks I've got everything figured out. Career, family, life. But sometimes it feels like I'm just holding all the pieces together, hoping they don't fall apart." Her voice carried a softness I hadn't heard before, stripped of the playful confidence she usually wore so easily. I could see it then, the vulnerability she rarely showed, the quiet weight of expectation she carried. I leaned forward, resting my arms lightly on the table. "I don't think anyone really has it figured out," I said honestly. "We just learn to pretend better as we get older." That made her laugh again, though this time it was gentler, more genuine. She shook her head, her hair falling slightly across her cheek, and in that moment she looked less like the untouchable, confident woman everyone admired and more like someone who longed to be understood. Without thinking too much, I reached across the table and rested my hand lightly over hers. My palm against the back of her hand, warm, steady, careful. For a heartbeat I wondered if I'd gone too far, if she would pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she let out a slow breath, almost as if the contact grounded her. Her hand felt delicate beneath mine, soft yet strong, and in that simple connection something unspoken passed between us. I wasn't there to solve her problems or carry her burdens. I was just there, present, listening. And that was enough. She turned her hand slightly, so her fingers brushed against mine. A subtle shift, but intentional. Our eyes met across the table, and the room felt suddenly smaller, quieter, as if the rest of the world had stepped aside to give us this moment. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" I asked. "For listening," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. I squeezed her hand gently before letting go, though every part of me wanted to hold on longer. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore, it was warm, filled with the quiet hum of trust. That night, as I lay awake, I realized it wasn't just the playful tension drawing me toward her. It was this, the way she let me see the cracks in her armor, the parts of herself she didn't share with just anyone. And the more I thought about it, the more I knew I didn't just want to be her kind of trouble. I wanted to be the person she could lean on, too. The days that followed carried a rhythm of their own. On the surface, everything looked normal. Conversations flowed, laughter filled the house, and gatherings went on as expected. But between her and me, there was a quiet undercurrent that neither of us could ignore. Every time we ended up in the same space, the air shifted, lighter yet heavier all at once. One evening, a group of us gathered in the living room. The fireplace crackled softly, casting warm light over everyone sprawled on couches and chairs. She chose the spot beside me. It could have been coincidence, at least that's what I told myself, but the way her knee brushed mine when she sat down didn't feel accidental. We talked casually with the others, but every few minutes, our attentions slipped back to each other. A glance. A smile. A subtle lean closer when one of us spoke. I noticed the way her perfume lingered, soft, elegant, impossible to ignore, and it made every inch of space between us feel far too small. At one point, she reached for the blanket draped over the couch. Her hand grazed mine as she pulled it free, and the contact was brief, fleeting, but it set off a spark that ran straight through me. She didn't pull away quickly. Instead, her fingers lingered for a heartbeat too long, as if testing how far she could go. My chest tightened, but I didn't move either. It was a silent agreement. We were both aware of the line, and we were both brushing against it. Later, as the room grew quieter, I caught her looking at me. Really looking. Her expression carried both curiosity and hesitation, as if she was trying to decide whether this, whatever this was, should be allowed to grow. I held her gaze, unflinching, and offered the faintest smile. She returned it, though hers was softer, edged with something like restraint. When the others began to leave for the night, she stayed behind, lingering in the glow of the fire. I stayed too. We ended up sitting closer, shoulders brushing now and then as we spoke in low voices. She teased me about something trivial, my way of speaking, or maybe the way I dodged a question earlier, and I fired back with playful words of my own. But beneath the laughter, every exchange carried weight, every word an excuse to prolong the closeness. There was a moment, small yet unforgettable, when she adjusted the blanket and let it fall slightly across my lap as well. It was nothing anyone else would have noticed. But for me, it was everything. A quiet claiming of space, a way of saying, "I'm letting you closer," without ever speaking the words. Of course, neither of us crossed the line completely. The world outside still existed, the eyes of family, the whispers of what others might think. Those hesitations clung to us, reminders of why we couldn't rush. But even with restraint, the truth was undeniable. We were both stepping closer, daring to test how far this invisible boundary could bend without breaking. And though no one else seemed to notice, I knew, she knew, that something had shifted. The game of glances and fleeting touches wasn't just coincidence anymore. It was choice. It was late, the kind of late when most of the house had already gone quiet. The laughter, the chatter, even the faint music had all faded into the background of the night. I stepped outside to breathe in the cool air, to let the stillness settle after a long evening. That's when I saw her. She was already there, leaning lightly against the balcony railing, a shawl draped over her shoulders. The glow from the porch light framed her in a soft halo, and for a moment I didn't move, I just watched. She looked peaceful, but there was a depth in her expression, as if her thoughts stretched far beyond the night sky she was gazing into. "You couldn't sleep either?" I asked gently, stepping closer. She turned her head and smiled faintly, a smile that carried both warmth and fatigue. "Something like that." I joined her at the railing, careful to leave just enough space between us. The night was cool, but not unkind, and the quiet seemed to wrap around us like a blanket. For a while, we said nothing. We just stood side by side, breathing in the silence, sharing it. It struck me then, how rare it was to feel this comfortable and quiet with someone. Most people rushed to fill silence with words, but with her, silence had weight. It wasn't emptiness. It was presence. At one point, our hands brushed against each other on the railing. neither of us moved them away. The contact was small, almost accidental, but it lingered, her fingers warm against mine, steady, unhurried. My chest tightened, and I felt my pulse quicken, but I didn't dare break the moment with words. I turned my head, and she was already looking at me. Her eyes held mine, steady and searching. It wasn't a bold look, not the kind meant to overwhelm, but something softer, vulnerable, questioning, as if she wanted to ask something she couldn't put into words. I almost spoke. The words sat heavy on the tip of my tongue. I feel it too. I want this too. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the awareness of how fragile the moment was, or maybe it was the respect I had for her silence. So instead of speaking, I just let my hand shift slightly, my fingers brushing over hers with quiet intent. Her breath caught, subtle but unmistakable, and then she leaned just slightly toward me. Not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to let me know she wasn't pulling away. Her shawl slipped, and instinctively, I lifted it back over her shoulders, my fingers grazing her collarbone as I did. She looked up at me then, her lips parted as though she might say something, but no words came. We stood there, suspended in a silence that said everything. The night air wrapped around us, cool and crisp, but the warmth between us was undeniable. It wasn't a confession spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. In that moment, with her hand brushing mine, her body leaning ever so slightly closer, the truth was already written between us. It was the kind of silence you remember forever, the kind where nothing is said, yet everything is understood. The following day carried a strange kind of stillness. Maybe it was me, replaying the night before in my mind, the silence, the way her hand had lingered near mine, the closeness that neither of us had named but both had felt. Or maybe it was her, moving through the house with that same graceful composure, but occasionally pausing as if caught in her own thoughts. By evening, most of the noise had faded. Friends were scattered, some heading home early, others tucked away in different rooms. I found her in the study, sitting on a couch with a book open in her lap. But the way her eyes drifted unfocused told me she hadn't been reading. "You hiding in here?" I asked softly, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe. Or maybe I just needed some quiet." I walked in, closing the door partway behind me. "Mind if I join?" She gestured to the spot beside her, and I sat down, leaving a respectful space between us. For a moment neither of us spoke. The air was thick with unspoken things, but not heavy, more like the pause before a decision is made. Finally, she sighed and set the book aside. "You know, you really are trouble," she said, her voice quiet but tinged with amusement. I smiled, meeting her gaze. "Your kind of trouble?" Her laugh was soft, almost reluctant, but her eyes warmed. She shook her head as if to deny it, yet she didn't pull away when I inched a little closer. There was a vulnerability in her then, something unguarded. I could see it in the way her hands rested loosely in her lap, in the way her shoulders eased when I didn't push, didn't demand. She was letting me in, little by little. "I've spent so long keeping my world steady," she murmured, her voice almost thoughtful. "And then you come along, and suddenly it feels unsteady again. But not in a bad way." Her honesty struck me deeply. I didn't want to overwhelm her with declarations, so I simply nodded, letting my actions speak. Slowly, I reached out and touched her hand. Not a grab, not a claim, just a gentle covering of her fingers with mine. She looked down at our hands, then back up at me. For a heartbeat, I thought she might pull away. Instead, she let her hand turn, her palm sliding against mine, her fingers curling ever so slightly around my own. The simple contact filled the space between us with warmth. I shifted closer, and before I could think too much, she leaned into me, her head finding its place lightly against my chest. My arms moved around her almost instinctively, holding her in a way that was both protective and tender. Her cheek rested near my heart, and I was suddenly aware of how steady, or maybe unsteady, my heartbeat had become. She didn't move, didn't speak, and neither did I. The hug lasted longer than it needed to, but not a second of it felt too much. When she finally pulled back, her smile was small but real, her eyes softened in a way I hadn't seen before. The wall between us wasn't gone completely, but a door had opened. Trust had been given, quietly, delicately, but undeniably. And in that moment I knew, the shift wasn't just in me anymore. It was in us. The weekend had come to its gentle end. People packed bags, exchanged goodbyes, and the house that had been full of noise and movement now carried the soft hush of departure. Yet even in the quiet bustle of goodbyes, I felt her presence close by, steady and undeniable, like a low hum beneath everything else. We didn't need to announce anything to anyone. No dramatic gestures, no declarations. It was enough to share the subtle glances, the almost secret smiles that passed between us when no one else was looking. And though my friend, her nephew, noticed the way we stood a little closer, the way our conversations stretched longer than necessary, he didn't say a word. He only gave me a look that carried both curiosity and acceptance, as if he'd already figured out what we were trying not to show. Later, when most of the farewells had ended and the house had quieted, we found ourselves alone again in the kitchen. The sunlight poured in through the window, painting the room in gold. She leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely, and smiled at me in that way she had, warm, knowing, a little teasing. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose this is where the weekend ends. Maybe for everyone else," I replied, stepping closer, my voice low. "But I don't think this ends here." Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then she reached out, almost absent-mindedly, and smoothed the collar of my shirt. It was such a small gesture, tender and familiar, yet it carried the weight of everything we hadn't put into words. I took her hand gently, letting my thumb trace across her knuckles. "I don't know what this is yet," I admitted. "But I know I don't want it to stop." Her expression softened, her playful edge giving way to something more vulnerable, more real. "You are trouble," she whispered again, but this time without any resistance in her tone. I smiled. "Your kind of trouble." The moment stretched, quiet but full. And then, without hesitation, she stepped closer, her hands slipping into mine fully. It wasn't dramatic, no sweeping kiss, no cinematic declaration. It was simpler, sweeter, two people choosing to walk into something uncertain, but wanting it all the same. We spent the rest of that afternoon together in small, ordinary ways. Cooking side by side. Sharing stories. Sitting close enough on the couch that our hands rested together naturally, fingers interlacing without thought. Each touch was a reassurance, each glance a silent promise that what had begun in teasing banter had grown into something steady and real. When it came time for me to leave, we stood by the door longer than necessary. She hugged me, slowly, fully, with her cheek resting against my chest and my arms wrapped around her waist. I felt her heartbeat against mine, steady and sure, and in that closeness, I knew the story didn't end here. As I walked away, I looked back once. She was still there in the doorway, watching, her smile faint but radiant. And in her eyes I saw it clearly, not just curiosity or attraction, but something deeper. Something that promised this was only the beginning. It was never just about being trouble. It was about being hers.